Well, howdy. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. John Lennox. Dr. Lennox is the Emeritus Professor of Mathematics at the University of Oxford and an Emeritus Fellow in Mathematics and Philosophy of Science at Green Templeton College at Oxford University. He regularly teaches at many academic institutions. He's a Senior Fellow with the Trinity Forum, and he's written a series of books exploring the relationship between science and Christianity. His most recent book is this one, Cosmic Christianity, Do God and Science Mix? And he's written even a shorter one that's more accessible that gets at a lot of the topics of today called Can Science Explain Everything? Dr. Lennox is known for his debates with Richard Dawkins, Peter Singer, and Christopher Hitchens on these kinds of topics. And even though we're virtual today, Dr. Lennox has visited our campus at Texas A&M a couple of times before, once for an in-person Veritas Forum, and once back in 2015 when he was awarded the Trotter Prize, which is an annual award for illuminating the connections between science, philosophy, and religion. Dr. Lennox, we are glad to have you, sir.
I'm delighted to be back with the Aggies.
Appreciate it. Well, let's dive right in. I wish we could have you back on campus soon, but virtual will have to do for now. So you've written this book that has this topic, do God and science mix, and can science explain everything? So let's start there. Many of your Oxford colleagues think that God and science do not mix, that they have nothing to do with each other. And in fact, at the beginning of your new book, you quote your colleague at Oxford, the famous chemist Peter Atkins. He writes, there's no reason to suppose that science cannot deal with every aspect of existence. So my first question is he right? Or are there things that science can't deal with?
Well, I've tangled with Peter a number of times, and it's really been quite fascinating. He is slightly elusive because he sometimes uses the word science in the older sense of the Latin scientia, simply to indicate rational knowledge of all kinds. And of course, if that's what he means, then he is more or less correct in what he says. But here, I'm sure he's speaking of the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, and so on. And his idea that they can deal with every aspect of existence is actually called scientism. It sounds impressive, but in my view, it is not only false, it's actually logically incoherent. For the very statement that the natural sciences can deal with every aspect of existence is not itself a statement of science. It is a meta-scientific statement. It's about science, and if it is true, it is false, since it cannot deal with its own existence. In other words, if scientism's basic principle is true, the statement expressing scientism must be false, so it refutes itself. Science actually is limited, and the great scientists have seen it. For example, Erwin Schrödinger, physics Nobel laureate, pioneer of quantum mechanics, which is a very big field represented at Texas A&M. He said this, "I'm very astonished that the scientific picture of the real world around me is very deficient. It gives us a lot of factual information, but it is ghastly silent about all and sundry that really matters to us. It cannot tell us a word about red and blue, bitter and sweet, physical pain and physical delight. It knows nothing of beautiful and ugly, good or bad, God and eternity." Science sometimes pretends to answer questions in these domains, but the answers are very often so silly that we're not inclined to take them seriously. But one person that figures very strongly in my thinking is another Nobel Prize winner, Sir Peter Medawar. And he said that the limits of science are demonstrated by the existence of questions that science cannot now and will never be able to answer. The so-called ultimate questions of the philosopher Karl Popper that even children ask. How did everything begin? What are we all here for? What's the point of living? And very interestingly, Peter Medawar added that it's not to science, but rather to imaginative literature and religion that we must turn for answers to such questions. And Francis Collins, the current director of NIH, the Templeton Prize winner last year, agrees. Science is powerless to answer questions such as, why did the universe come into being? What is the meaning of human existence? And what happens after we die? And to give you a concrete example, Albert Einstein and Richard Feynman, again, both physics Nobel Prize winners, point out what should be obvious, that ethical values lie outside the realm of science. Now, to back all this up, I think the important thing to say, Micah, is that a scientific explanation of something is not necessarily the only rational explanation that is possible. Indeed, there can be multiple explanations. Suppose you ask, why is this water boiling? I might say that heat energy from the gas flame is being conducted through the copper base of the kettle. It's agitating the molecules of the water, and so the water is boiling. That's a scientific explanation. Or I might say the water is boiling because I just love a cup of tea. Now, both of these explanations are rational. They each make perfect sense, but they're very different. The first is scientific, and the second is personal, involving my intentions, my will, and my desire. And what's obvious is that science cannot yield the second explanation, but the two explanations don't conflict or even compete. They complement each other. And what is more, and this is most important, I think, that both explanations are necessary for a full explanation. And one might even argue that the explanation in terms of personal agency is arguably the more important, even though science cannot give it to you, because people have been enjoying drinking tea for millennia before they knew anything about heat equations. And Aristotle pointed all this out centuries ago when he distinguished between a material cause, the kettle, the water, the gas, and so on, and the final cause, my desire for a stimulating beverage. So science can't answer all the questions. Scientism is false, and we need to open our minds to the fact that there are different levels of experience. Putting it this way to conclude, science and God do not compete as explanations for the universe any more than Henry Ford and automobile engineering compete as explanations for the motor car.
So just to recap for the students, coming along, some of the things you listed that science can't do include conscious experience, beauty, right and wrong, ultimate questions of beginning, purposes of the universe after what happens to us after we die, and even the personal reasons why we might do something like build a car or boil a cup of tea. Well, in response to that, there are some scientists have said, okay, I agree with you, you're right. So religion can potentially speak to some of those kinds of questions about purpose, about right and wrong. And so science tells us what, and then religion tells us why, and the two never actually overlap or have anything to say to each other. Do you think that's true, that the two never talk to each other?
No, I don't. But it's a very popular idea called non-overlapping magisteria. But it's false, because I often find that there's a subtext there, that people who say that science deals with the what and religion deals with the why, if you pursue that carefully, you'll discover that they think science deals with reality, and that religion deals with fiction, Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, and God, and so on. Now, I will grant this, because it's very important, because I've essentially just said it, that science does concentrate on the how and the what. It also tries to give answers, and often succeeds, to the why of function. Why is this bit there, and so on. But what it doesn't deal with is the teleological why, the why of purpose, those existential questions. But there is overlap. And I think the easiest way to illustrate that overlap is to take the first statement in the Bible, the Hebrew Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the writer is talking about the very same cosmos that cosmologists today study, and is claiming that there is a beginning, which is exactly what the majority of astrophysicists and so on claim today. So there is a very important overlap. A second, equally important overlap, I would suggest, is that in the Genesis account of creation, there's constant emphasis on God spoke, God said. And I'd like to suggest that this is telling us that it's a word-based universe. Now, coming over into science, we use words of all kinds to describe scientific realities. First of all, mathematics, and then, of course, in genetics, the longest word we've discovered is the DNA code, a word-based universe. So there's a hint in the Bible, which is, of course, not a scientific textbook, but it tells us that information is a very important concept. And of course, it has been left to modern physics to reveal that that is so. So there's a very fertile and fruitful overlap that I think it's very important to explore. But 99% of science is not dealing with questions that have a religious or even a philosophical dimension. We must realize that to keep things in proportion. There are areas, though, like origins in particular, and the nature of human beings, where we come much closer to that intersection between the two fields.
Got it. So the areas of science where we start to encounter pointers toward religious truth may be related to origins. How did the universe begin? How is the universe potentially set up for us to be here? The origin of information, and then the nature of humans. That makes sense. Just a quick reminder to our audience. At about 12:40 Central Time, I'm going to I'll be quiet and start bringing up questions from y'all, and so use the suggest tab there on the website to write questions. And then if you don't have any questions, you can go and upvote or downvote specific question that you think, oh, that's a really interesting one, I'd like to hear Dr. Lennox address that one. So I'll try to aim to do that around 12:40. Well, I do have one big common definition that I think we ought to hit real fast. I've heard from Peter Atkins and Richard Dawkins and other famous scientists like that, when they think of religion, when they think of faith, the definition they typically give involves belief despite a lack of evidence, right? They'll say faith is belief without evidence, saying, oh, I just have faith, I just believe. And so they view it as sub-rational, and so therefore it's something a scientist wouldn't do. How would you tweak their definition of faith?
Well, I wouldn't tweak it. I'd reject it completely. I think it's entirely false, and it's hopelessly misleading and leads to nonsense like this. Atheists do not have faith, says Richard Dawkins, in a book that is all about what he has faith in, his atheist philosophy that he has great faith in. And the point is, this is a false definition that has come about through the group of people led by Dawkins that we call the New Atheists. They think that faith is a religious word and it means believing where there's no evidence. And they're quite wrong, because faith is an everyday concept. And they give the game away, actually, by frequently using it as such. Back to the Oxford English Dictionary, the word faith comes from the Latin fides, and we get fidelity from that. It means loyalty or trust. And if we've any sense, which most of us have, we don't normally trust or have faith in facts or people without evidence. Making well-motivated, evidence-based decisions is just how faith is normally exercised. Think of how you get your bank manager to trust you, or the basis for the faith you exercise to get on board an aircraft. Now, the important thing is that believing where there's no evidence is what we usually call blind faith.
Right.
And no doubt, in all religions, you will sadly find adherents who believe blindly, and that can be dangerous. But you'll also find atheists who are guilty of blind faith, and I'm afraid Dawkins himself is one of them when he says that atheists do not have faith. Now, I can't speak for other religions, but the faith expected on the part of Christians is certainly not blind. I would have no interest in it if it were. And perhaps the clearest expression of that is that where the gospel writer John explains why he's writing, and he says this, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these," the ones he's put in his book, that is, "are written." Why? "So that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name." In other words, John is claiming that his account of the life of Jesus contains eyewitness record of evidence on which faith in Christ can be based. And a strong case can be made that much of the material in the Gospels is based on eyewitness testimony. So my faith as a Christian is evidence-based, and that's exactly like my faith in science.
So to recap for the students online, instead of blind faith, which would be faith for no reason and with no evidence, it's an evidence-based faith, which kind of makes sense for how we trust things in everyday life. We trust things that are trustworthy, and that is rational. Good
Summary.
Great. Yeah. Let's shift gears briefly and talk about science itself. I'm in an air-conditioned office right now. I've got a computer right here. I have a smartphone right here. So science is pretty normal to us, but that really hasn't completely been the case for all of human history. The level of trust we have in science and the level of sophistication that we have in science is relatively modern. It's just within the last few hundred years. So I wanted to ask you, what are the assumptions that people need in order to start doing science? What are the baseline assumptions and almost like faith claims you have to say to get just started doing science? I guess you've written about like the idea that the belief that the universe is orderly, things along those lines.
Yeah, that's right. And your point is crucially important, because this false definition of faith as blind faith in religion conceals often for many people that science involves faith absolutely essentially. You cannot do science without believing it can be done. You must start, as you just said, with a faith commitment in the rational, indeed the mathematical intelligibility of the universe. And Albert Einstein once said he couldn't conceive a genuine man of science without that profound faith. So that is absolutely right that it's not commonplace across history, since science did arise relatively recently. And when you look into that historically, let me quote an ancient historian, Edwin Judge, very famous in Australia. And he says the modern world is a product of a revolution in scientific method. Both experiment in science and the citing of sources as evidence in history arose from the worldview of Jerusalem, not Athens, from Jews and Christians, not the Greeks. Now that's hugely important. And C.S. Lewis summed it up brilliantly when he wrote this: "Men became scientific because they expected law in nature. They expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator." In other words, the science of people like Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Clark, Maxwell, Faraday, and a host of others, their faith in God didn't hinder their science. It was the motor that drove it. So there's an intimate connection between the rise of modern science and belief in a creator.
So a belief that the universe would be orderly. It seems like the other assumption you'd have to make in order to get started on science would relate to like not just the outside world, but our own brain and our own ability to understand the way that the world works. Is that right?
Yeah, it is very right, and it's hugely important. You see, if I'm to believe in the rational intelligibility of the cosmos, I must also believe that I can trust my brain or my mind. And many of my colleagues tell me with a straight face that the brain with which they do science is the end product of mindless, natural, unguided processes. And I always ask them, why then should you trust it? And I put to them a question, and I find this fascinating. I say, look, if you thought that your computer or smartphone indeed was the end product of mindless, unguided processes, would you trust it? And I've always pushed for an answer, and the answer has always been no. And I say, you clearly have a problem. And then I tell them something that sometimes surprises them. I say that Darwin saw this problem long ago when he wrote, with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. And indeed, one of the founders of neo-Darwinism, the British chemist, biologist, statistician J.B.S. Haldane, memorably said, "It seems to me immensely unlikely that mind is a mere byproduct of matter, for if my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true. They may be sound chemically, but that does not make them sound logically, and hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms." Now, what is so interesting that in recent years, the brilliant New York philosopher Thomas Nagel thinks exactly the same. In his book Mind and Cosmos, which has a very provocative subtitle, Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the World is Almost Certainly False. And Nagel, remembers, a strong atheist who doesn't want there to be a God. And yet he says this, if the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. In other words, what I'm saying is that if you follow the atheistic view, this reductionist view, it undermines the very foundations of the reality, the rationality that's needed to construct or understand or believe in any argument whatsoever, let alone a scientific one. So atheism begins to sound like a great self-contradictory delusion. That is a persistent false belief held in the face of strong contradictory evidence. Now, I entitled my book, Cosmic Chemistry, Do God and Science Mix? But in it, I argue strongly that atheism and science don't mix very well.
So let's think this through. So what you had just said is that what you're describing is reductionism, the idea
Yes.
that we reduce everything. And as a chemical engineer, I typically do this, right? I have a little bottle full of catalyst here, and when I think about that catalyst, I'm thinking completely about its atomic composition. But if I reduce myself to atoms alone, then eventually that means that I'm just a meat computer that doesn't actually rationally think things through and may
Yes.
not be able to rationally understand the world. You mentioned Nagel. I think, if I remember, Nagel was also worried about the idea of consciousness. Like, my computer may be reliable, but I don't think it has an inner thought life like I do or like you do. So is that what Nagel's getting at? Is that if you're just atoms, then you don't have an inner thought life?
Well, I think that's part of the truth. Nobody knows what consciousness is. It's one of the big black holes that science is trying to work around, but we don't know what it is. So all we can do there is speculate. What I think he's getting at is a perfectly logical argument that Lewis saw a long time ago. He said, any theory that invalidates thinking cannot itself be valid because we reach it by thinking. In other words, that kind of logic, which is based on simply following out the presuppositions of atheism, leads to the demise of rationality. My teacher of quantum mechanics put it this way. He said, that extreme reductionism reduces thought to the mere firing of synapses in the brain. And that, therefore, everything dissolves into meaninglessness. And we know that cannot be true. So what Nagel is sensing is there's a real root problem at the heart of evolutionary naturalism in this sense.
Got it. So just if we think through the book, I mean, you've given us a number of pointers that the materialist, reductionist view of the world is incomplete. It can't deal with questions of origin. It can't deal with questions of purpose. It undermines human rationality. It doesn't know why the universe is orderly and governed by laws. But someone could argue that they could listen to all that and say, yes, sounds good, I agree. Now I'm going to go be a deist. A deist is someone who believes in a God who may kickstart the universe and then walks away and never interacts with it. But I don't get the impression that you're a deist. So how would you distinguish the God you're talking about versus that of deism?
Well, I am not a deist. I'm glad you've perceived that. But there's a certain extent to which they're right so far in the argument, because what I begin to talk with, the first step in all of this, is the establishing of the existence of God. But then we come to the next question, which is the nature of that God. What is the nature of the Creator? Now, you will not determine much about the nature of the Creator from the natural sciences. You've got to go beyond them. And the first important thing to say there is, in going beyond them, you're not going beyond rationality. I want to go beyond natural science for my evidence on which I base my faith in Christianity to two main sources, history and experience. And both of these are rational disciplines. First of all, history. Christianity's central assertions have to do with claims about the historical person of Jesus, life, teaching, miracles, indicating who he was, death, resurrection, ascension, and so on. Now, these claims are made in a book, the New Testament. So the first thing to say is that the documentary evidence establishing the text of that New Testament is far better. I find that many people do not know this. It's far better than for any book of ancient history that is accepted by scholars as authentic. For instance, the Roman historian Tacitus wrote his Annals of Imperial Rome around AD 116, and the first 6 books of the Annals survive in only one manuscript that was copied in about AD 850, 700 years after the original. What about the New Testament? Not one manuscript, but nearly 6,000 partial or complete manuscripts in the original Greek, and over 18,000 early translations and thousands of quotations of the New Testament by the early church fathers who wrote between the 2nd and 4th centuries. And some of those manuscripts are of very great antiquity. Bodmer papyri, containing about 2/3 of the Gospel of John, dated as early as AD 200, and the Rylands fragment of John's Gospel even earlier. So that as for historicity, which is hugely important in this, it turns out that Luke, the author of the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, the first history of Christianity, was a brilliant ancient historian. And the Roman historian in Oxford here, A.N. Sherwin-White, acknowledged that although all sources have limitations and come from a particular perspective, he says, for Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity, even in matters of detail, must now appear absurd. Now, it's important to point out that these things do not prove in the mathematical sense that what the documents say is true, but they do establish certain historical credentials that mean the manuscripts need to be taken seriously. Now, the central claim of Christianity is that Jesus is God become human, and that is evidenced by his resurrection. Now, I believe that as a scientist, on the basis of my conviction that not only are science and God compatible, but science and certain claims for miracle, like the resurrection, are also compatible. Science can't and doesn't exclude the possibility of the supernatural. It can tell us brilliantly the nature of the regularities built into the universe that we formulate as the laws of nature. But God, the Creator, can feed a new event into that system of the cosmos to give special evidence of his involvement in it. And the most important one is the resurrection of Christ, evidenced by the empty tomb and the appearances of the risen Lord to his disciples. Now, a historical point. Historian Michael Grant from Edinburgh University writes, "True," he says, "the discovery of the empty tomb is differently described by the various Gospels, but if we apply the same sort of criteria that we would apply to any other ancient literary sources, then the evidence is firm and plausible enough to necessitate the conclusion that the tomb was indeed found empty. Not only that, the evidence for the appearances of Jesus is so strong that even German atheist scholar Gert Lüdemann deduces this, I quote, "It may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ." But Christianity doesn't only assert the facts that Jesus died and rose again. It says that these events have implications for all of us and challenges us to do something about him. And I firmly believe that God does not just exist in some academic, philosophical way. He's alive and active in the world, working in our lives and reaching out to us. And I think my final point here, if I may, is this. I'm often asked, how can I be a scientist and a Christian since everything in science is testable? But surely nothing in Christianity is. But it is, you know. Christianity can be tested. And first, of course, we need to see what its message is. It asserts that there's something flawed about us humans, that we've rebelled against God and we've messed up our own lives and sometimes, sadly, even the lives of others. I need forgiveness. I need peace of heart, new motivation and power to live a satisfying and meaningful life. The Christian message is that this flaw is too deep for us to repair ourselves. And perhaps this is the most important thing I'll be saying this evening, this is where Christianity ceases to be what most people think of as a religion. I find that when I ask people what they think a religion is, they say it's a program for improvement. There's a path to be followed. There are teachers to help us on our way to a final assessment. And if we keep the rules pretty well, their merit in good behavior exceeds our deficit in bad behavior, we'll eventually be accepted. The basic principle is that of a university like yours, a degree system. It's merit. But Christianity is not a religion like that. It tells me straight that I cannot merit God's forgiveness or acceptance. I don't have the capacity to do that. It's very humbling for me to face this, but it's true. But now comes the wonderful thing, which shows us why the message is good news. We who can't merit forgiveness by our own efforts can receive it as a free gift from God because of what Christ has done in dying for our sins on the cross. Now, this goes very deep. And there's a mystery about it. So how then can we test it? Well, let me finish with this. Think of what Jesus promises to those who turn away from their sin and trust him for salvation. He promises peace with God, forgiveness, a new life with new powers, new desires, opportunities, new fellowship, friendship with God, a deep love for a new community, as well as resources to cope with life's pain and suffering. All of it flooding life with new meaning. It's not difficult to test that. First, you can read the New Testament and see what effect the message that Jesus and the apostles brought had on those who engaged with them, taking love to the unloved, bringing sanity to the mentally unstable, health to the diseased, a new hope to the hopeless, salvation to the lost. And what happened then still happens now. Otherwise, I wouldn't be talking to you today. You see, Jesus says that if we repent, that is, turn away from the wrong things that have damaged us, if we put our trust in him, then certain things will happen. We will receive forgiveness, peace with God, a new life and a new power. Here is what he himself said. Truly, truly, I say to you, whoever hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life. They do not come into judgment, but have passed from death to life. That's real acceptance. You see, faith in the full Christian sense means that in a deliberate act of commitment and trust, I received from Christ the gift of salvation that I could not earn or provide for ourselves. Some years ago, I was speaking at another Veritas Forum, and immediately after I'd finished, up on the balcony, a Chinese student stood up and loudly cried, "Look at me." It was quite startling, and we all looked, and his face was beaming, and I said, "Why should we look at you?" And he called back something like this. He said, "6 months ago, my life was in such a mess. I'd no peace and I saw no way out. I was taken to a lecture you gave at another university. I think it was UPenn. And something you said triggered a response in me. A few weeks later, I gave my life to Christ. Just look at me now." He was radiating a joy that all of us could see. He had tested Christianity and found it to be true. And the proof of the pudding's in the eating. And I've seen this again and again, and seen how this encounter, which is very real, with the risen Christ can transform people's problems with their relationships, with money, with alcohol and drugs, stress, depression, and innumerable other things, and completely transform them. So to conclude this, seeing that happen again and again provides convincing evidence for me of the transforming power of Christ, the lives of those who turn to him. To fail to get to know him is to miss life's ultimate purpose and joy. But his message for all of us is that because of what he's done, we don't have to miss out on anything at all.
Well, that's a great note on which to turn to some questions from our audience. We have Texas A&M faculty and staff and students. So here's a question from Sam. Sam asks, how has pursuing science and mathematics in your career personally strengthened or illuminated your Christian faith?
Thanks, Sam, for that question. I love mathematics and I'm passionate about it. And I suppose the first thing I would say that fascinated me is that mathematics works. And it was a Nobel Prize winner, Eugene Wigner, who once wrote a famous paper called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. And he said we didn't deserve it. And what he meant by that was, how is it possible that here's a mathematician and she's thinking about the universe and comes up with an equation and it fits what's going on out there? And he says it's unreasonably effective. I say, no, it isn't. Because he was looking at it from an atheistic perspective. And of course, it's totally unreasonable from an atheistic perspective. But it's not unreasonable from a theistic perspective, which is exactly why Newton and Kepler and so on had the view that doing mathematics was thinking God's thoughts after him. And I suppose it's perceiving the sheer beauty of the structure of the universe. I remember when I first got to grips with Newton's second law and gravitation and so on, and was able to show students how to derive the elliptical orbits of the planets from that. It's really exciting stuff. But it was the logic of mathematics. Mathematics does at least teach you to appreciate the logic of an argument. And when I discovered in the beginning, mainly through the work of C.S. Lewis, that I could take Christianity as seriously as I took mathematics, that was an immense strengthening of my faith.
Well, in a similar vein, Reed asks, what are three books, I know it's going to be hard to narrow it down to three books that have changed your life?
Well, Mere Christianity by Lewis is one of them. And The Abolition of Man by Lewis is another one, because of his brilliant working out of the effect of naturalism on our concept of ourselves. There are many others by him. Another book that deeply influenced me was the Life and Times of Jesus the Messiah by a man called Edersheim, a man with a Jewish background who understood the conditions in Palestine in those days and who brilliantly expounded the Gospels for us. And coming up to more modern times, my faith in God has been enormously strengthened by reading books like The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, because of seeing the shallowness of their argument. Now, they're not Christian books at all, but you see, what I've tried to do, Reid, in my life is two things. One, to examine the positive side for Christianity, but the other is to be vulnerable, to allow people to ask me the hard questions. And what I've discovered is by doing that and reading their stuff and getting to know the inner workings of their minds, that has immeasurably strengthened my conviction that Christianity has real answers to the deepest problems of life, not simplistic ones, but real ones. So that's my first shot off the top of my head, but there are many other books that have influenced me.
So we have a question from Ricardo, and this may be a long question. Students major in things like biology and geology, and they wonder in their biology or geology classes, are those classes and what they learn there mutually exclusive with the belief in God?
Not at all. Well, of course, unless you tell me what it is in your classes that you think is mutually
And I think they're
exclusive.
worried about age of the Earth.
Oh, I
evolution,
see.
things like that.
I see. Yes. Well, perhaps I'll sound like a revolutionary to you folks then, because I don't think the Bible really has anything at all to say about the age of the earth, quite irrespective of what you think about the days of Genesis. Now, if you want to know what I think about those, I'll shamelessly advertise the fact that I've written a book on the topic, which has just been updated and republished in a 10th anniversary edition in the last couple of weeks. But you see, just a very short answer to this question. What does the Bible say? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then there follows a sequence of days. And God said, and that's day 1, day 2, and you're all aware of that. But the very interesting thing is that in Hebrew grammar, and I get this from a scientist who's one of the world's top Hebrew translators, C. Jack Collins, and he points out that in the Hebrew language, there are 2 past tenses, and both are used in Genesis 1. And the tense changes. In the first tense, you get in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And then the other tense is used for the narrative following, day 1, day 2, and so on. And he makes the point that the change in tenses is to indicate that the first statement occurred, I quote, at an indefinite period before the second. Well, if it's indefinite, we don't know what it is. So here's the irony of it all. Whatever you believe about those days, and I have suggestions to make, they don't make the earth young. So I don't think you have to worry about your geology very much.
Another really good question that's coming is, what is something that you've wrestled with when you're dealing with evidence of God and facts of science? Is there anything that's given you pause and made you say, like, whoa, I need to really think about this and wrestle with it?
Well, many things give me pause, of course. And I've wrestled with many questions. But, very often with my colleagues, brilliant scientists, as many of them are, their biggest question, and it's my hardest question as a Christian, is the problem of suffering and evil. And they'll say, okay, maybe there's evidence in the universe of a cosmic designer, but look at the mess the world's in. How do you possibly square that? And that's not an easy question to answer. Indeed, when the coronavirus hit, I sat down and wrote a little book about it. Where is God in a coronavirus world? Because I knew it would force people to think very hard. And I have no simplistic answers. But I believe that in the unique story of Christianity, which talks about a God who suffers in Christ on the cross, a deep mystery, that at least we can begin to see that God understands this problem too. And that brings me near into finding a window into a hope. I'll put it as modestly as that. You see, if there were no resurrection, if Jesus hadn't conquered death, I would have no hope at all. And I would be an atheist, I think. And the situation would be absolutely bleak. And that's something to take on board, because many of my friends, and I understand it perfectly, they reject God because of suffering. But then they've got rid of all ultimate hope. There are only intermediate hopes, but ultimately there's their own extinction and the heat death of the universe and nothing. But I have real hope that there is to be a resurrection of the dead, because Jesus promised that if I trusted him, not only would I receive new life here, but that new life would eventually raise me from the dead. Now, you may think that's absolutely crazy, but it's tied up with who I believe Jesus Christ to be. And one has to work on these things step by step. And I've written a great deal. And by the way, you might want to look at my website, where I've talked a great deal on this problem, which is probably the number one question I'm asked, certainly in the United States.
Here's a question that will warm your mathematician heart. Elizabeth says, I hope to teach math. How can I include God in the way that I teach math?
Well, that's a very tricky question. You see, I've been teaching maths all my life, but I was employed in the university to teach mathematics, not to teach about God. Now, if philosophical questions come up, then that's okay. But we need to be hugely careful. So what I did was that I would give lectures outside of class, but I'd let my students know, just in case you're interested in hearing my views, I'm doing a lecture. And it was in that way they came to know. Sadly, some scientists abuse their position to teach atheism in class. And I think that's quite illegitimate if they're paid to teach science. They're not paid to teach a metaphysical viewpoint. And I take it seriously for myself as a Christian. And I just trust and pray that God will give me opportunities to speak to people. And as they get to know you privately, often they will ask you for your private views, and then you can do it. But you need to be careful that if you're paid and employed to do something, you must do that thing.
I'm getting the sense a lot of our audience are actually Christians. And Jeffrey asked a really good question. He says, what is something that believers often misunderstand about science or rationality?
Well, we've begun to deal with one of those, that it's the power of science to explain everything. And Medawar, I didn't mention this during my interview, Medawar also said it does science a great disservice to think it can answer every question. And the thing is, I welcome science. I want to encourage believers who are scientifically gifted to get involved, because if you're involved, you then earn the right to comment on it. But I encourage them to think about their science and think about its implications for our understanding of ourselves. That's what got me going as a teenager. I was fascinated by maths, and I asked a simple question: where did it fit in science? Then I asked, where does science fit into the big picture? How much does it tell us? And if we go beyond science to history and so on, what extra can we learn? So I was into this at a very early age, and I found it helped me develop an integrated worldview. And that's what Veritas is all about, is exposing people to differing worldviews so that they can make up their minds about their own. I'm not sure that has answered the question, but that's the way I would begin to look at this.
Yeah, I'm sure part of the question is coming from, in the United States, sometimes there's a stereotype that believers in science are unfriendly to each other, that
Oh, I
scientists don't
see. Yes.
think.
Okay.
So
That.
I of course would love to get us out of that stereotype. How do you think we
Oh,
can do a
yes.
better
Well,
job with that?
so would I. That may be more culture specific, because that is relatively rare in
Mm,
this country.
mm,
And I think we must do all we can to fight that kind of obscurantism, because it is, well, it brings a very bad repute on Christianity. And one of the easiest things we can do is to remind people that the great pioneers of science were most of them Christians, not simply believers in God, and that many of the discoveries were made by Christians. And at the moment, quite a cohort of Christians working to fight coronavirus. And this is marvelous stuff. But that obscurantism that's afraid of science is a very, very sad thing indeed, especially when churches start to teach it and discourage young people from going into science. And sadly, in some parts of the world, the question you asked earlier about the age of the earth is sadly a touchstone when it needn't be. And it saddens me as a Christian to see believers arguing over things that the Bible doesn't even claim.
I'll admit, for myself, I was shocked when I found out that Christians were arguing about how to interpret Genesis back in the 4th century, long
Oh, well,
before
they
Darwin.
were, which shows that it was difficult even then.
Right.
So we might be excused for finding it a bit difficult now.
Yeah, some of the Kepler quotes that you shared really resonated with me. This idea of thinking God's thoughts after him. So, I mean, I work in a university. We have students. There are labs right upstairs from me right now. And that idea, if that a student, they discover something new. So here's the whole body of human knowledge. A student discovers something new, and they think those thoughts. They're the first human to think those thoughts, because no one ever knew that about chemistry or physics.
Yeah,
They're the first
fantastic.
person to think that since God, and now they are thinking this thing that God knew.
That's right.
Yeah,
It's extremely exciting. And the mandate for science is in Genesis. This is one of the most interesting things I ever came across. God told the humans to name the animals. Now, that's taxonomy. Taxonomy, classification in terms of names, is the fundamental academic discipline in every area. We name things, and in that sense, we tame them. And God was saying, you do it for yourself. Now, the interest of that lies in the fact that earlier in Genesis, God named certain things, 4 or 5 of them. God called the dry land earth, and he called the firmament heaven. But he didn't name everything. He told the humans, you go and do it. And so science, in that sense, is a very honorable, God-given task, and therefore we can do it for him.
I'll give a quote from Kepler that means a lot to me. Kepler says, "The diversity of the phenomena of nature is so great, and the treasures hidden in the heavens so rich, precisely in order that the human mind shall never be lacking in fresh nourishment."
Oh, that's wonderful. I'd never heard that before.
Yeah, I mean, Kepler's effectively
That's
telling us,
beautiful. That
we have
is
no right to
superb.
be bored.
No, we have not. We have
so
not.
so some people grab a telescope and see the heavens like Kepler did. In my circles, we usually grab a microscope, and there's
No,
plenty
well, I
of
grab a
treasure there.
telescope. I've got a
Yeah.
10-inch telescope in my garden.
Well, that's a good one, I think, to end on. I want everybody to thank Dr. Lennox again for being with us, and I want to give a few kind of notes of where you can go from here. So we mentioned the big book, Cosmic Chemistry: Do God and Science Mix? But this is kind of a magnum opus. It's a little bit thicker. So if you're looking to get started on some of the questions that we talked about today, Dr. Lennox's book, Does Science Explain Everything? Is a great place to start. If you're interested in the questions of biblical interpretation that he brought up earlier, it's, I believe, 7 Days That Changed the World. You said, right?
7 Days That Divide the World.
Oh, that
Yeah.
divide the world. Okay, very good. I read that a couple of years ago. Really loved it.
And if they want to see debates about this thing, you might mention the film I've done, which might interest some of the students.
Yes, it's called Against the Tides.
Yep.
Okay, if you just Google John Lennox, Against the Tides is a new documentary that's come out with Dr. Lennox and with the famous actor Kevin Sorbo. The first half really hits a lot of the topics that we've hit over the last hour. And then the second half of the documentary, you actually go to Israel and actually talk about these places where Jesus walked and the miracles he did, and the idea that it's not just a philosophy, but a discussion of something historical, something that actually happened. I got to see this film a couple of weeks ago and really loved it. All right, we are just about out of time. Thank you again, Dr. Lennox. We really
My
appreciate your
pleasure.
time. And I know a lot of
Aggie,
people.
Aggie, Aggie.
Yeah. And there are a lot more questions, but I'm sure we can get to those in due time. Thank you again, everybody, for coming. And thank you, Dr. Lennox. Gig 'em.